The call came just as I was pouring my morning coffee, my hands still trembling slightly from the medication remnants of the 4th round of chemo I'd completed only weeks ago. The voice on the other end was sterile, like it had been rehearsed a dozen times before. "Ms. Harper, we need you in the conference room on the 27th floor by 9 a.m. Don't be late." No warm greetings, no acknowledgement of the fact that I'd just beaten cancer. I had spent nearly 2 decades at Langford Cole Strategic Group, a legacy financial firm in downtown Minneapolis. Almost 20 years of navigating crises, mergers, budget freezes, and executive reshuffles. I had been the constant through it, all mentoring, rebuilding, retaining top clients when others panicked. I wasn't flashy. I didn't lobby for praise or play office politics. I just worked hard, faithfully. Even when they cut my benefits during treatment. Even when younger, trendier hires started getting all the spotlight. So when I walked into that glass-walled conference room, that morning sunlight pouring in like judgment, I already had a sense of what was coming. But what I wasn't prepared for was the coldness of the delivery. No gratitude. No dignity. Just Amanda Graves, the new 30-something CEO who used to fetch coffee for my old supervisor, saying calmly, "Ms. Harper, as part of our organizational refresh, your role is no longer necessary." No longer necessary. The words struck harder than I expected. A quiet verdict that dismissed every late night, every weekend, every Zoom call I'd taken from a hospital bed. I didn't flinch. I sat tall, hands folded neatly in my lap, just like I taught every junior associate to do when preparing for high-stakes negotiations. What they didn't know was that I had seen this coming. Weeks ago, an internal email chain had landed in my inbox by mistake. A thread outlining Amanda's plan to streamline legacy operations by phasing out long-tenured resources. Her words, not mine. I was one of those resources. A 58-year-old cancer survivor who no longer fit the brand narrative Amanda was pitching to investors. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that I had a plan of my own. The moment I stepped into that conference room, I felt it in the air thick with something unspoken, like walking into a house where someone's just slammed a door. Amanda sat at the head of the table, her expression carefully composed behind expensive glasses that seemed more ornamental than necessary. To her left was Darren Knox, the head of HR, who had never made eye contact with anyone over 50 unless it was to confirm retirement paperwork. And flanking the other side was my direct supervisor, Ethan Morrison, a junior associate I had mentored through 2 promotions, now hiding a smug little curl at the corner of his mouth that told me he'd been waiting for this. Amanda didn't bother with pleasantries, nor did she acknowledge the fact that just a few months ago, I was sitting in that very chair while battling cancer, still logging hours from a hospital bed because leadership continuity was so crucial. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her voice even and strangely impersonal, as though she were reading aloud from a PowerPoint slide. "Caroline, we appreciate your years of service, but as part of Langford Cole's new strategic direction, we're realigning our talent structure to reflect the future of our brand. Your role has been deemed no longer essential." The words landed like a quiet detonation. No longer essential, not restructured, not evolving needs, just obsolete. As if everything I'd built to vary, late night negotiating with fragile clients, every training document I hand wrote because no one else cared enough, every ounce of loyalty I had given without asking anything in return had expired with the ink of a signature on some internal memo I was never meant to see. I said nothing at first, choosing instead to keep my posture composed, legs crossed at the ankle, hands folded gently in my lap like my grandmother had taught me when I was a girl. I had learned long ago that in rooms like this, silence often spoke louder than outrage. But Ethan, never good with stillness, couldn't resist twisting the knife. He leaned back, arms folded, and said in that new voice he'd acquired since getting promoted, "We're just streamlining, Caroline, trimming the fat. You know how it is." Darren flinched, his pen pausing mid-scratch on a clipboard, but he said nothing. Amanda didn't even blink, and I knew at that exact moment I was not in the presence of leaders. I was sitting across from opportunists, children playing executive in clothes too big for their ethics. From the corner of the room, I heard a soft, hesitant voice. "Please don't take it personally, Caroline, it's just business." It was Jamie, a young analyst barely 2 years into the company, eyes darting nervously between Amanda and me. I had once helped Jamie fix a payroll error late at night and told her not to worry, that these things happen. Now, she looked at me like someone watching a pet being put down, sympathetic, but afraid to speak up. I gave her a small nod and turned back to the table. Understood, I said simply, my voice steady. I appreciate the clarity. That seemed to throw them off. Amanda tilted her head. Darren stopped writing, and Ethan blinked twice, as if he'd missed a line in the script. They had expected me to cry, to argue, to beg to behave like someone cornered. What they didn't realize was that I had already passed through a far darker tunnel than this. 3 weeks earlier, I had received an internal email by accident tone that detailed, in brutally casual language, Amanda's plan to phase out senior employees by framing it as modernization. My name was explicitly listed under Phase 2, high-impact legacy roles. They hadn't even tried to disguise it. I read the entire thread at my kitchen table with a cup of green tea, still warm in my hand, and by the end, I wasn't angry. I was focused. Since that night, I had begun working quietly, methodically. I backed up every document I had improved, every module of the client management system I had rebuilt from scratch during nights and weekends. All done from my personal computer, away from company networks, logged with timestamps and saved under my own credentials. I had gone through cancer and back. No one was going to take my work, my worth, or my name away from me. Back in the conference room, Amanda slid a manila envelope toward me. Inside, you'll find your severance terms, she said, already preparing to move on to the next agenda item. We'll need your laptop, ID, badge, and phone by end of day. The team will be informed this afternoon. The team. My team. People I had recruited, trained, encouraged when their confidence faltered. People who came to me for help when upper management stopped listening. They weren't just colleagues, they were witnesses to what I had built here. And more than that, they were the only ones who truly understood what would be lost when I walked out that door. I took the envelope but didn't open it. Thank you, I said, rising from my seat, my tone as calm and measured as if I had just finished a quarterly review. I'll be out before the day is over. As I walked down the hallway, past framed motivational posters and potted plants I had seen wilt and be replaced over the years, I passed the executive lounge where Amanda's new leadership cohort was preparing for a weekend retreat in Aspen. Their laughter echoed through the glass walls, forced and shallow like the final chorus of a show that no longer had an audience. I returned to my office, shut the door gently, and locked it behind me. Then I reached for my personal phone and sent a short, precise message to a contact I had been quietly nurturing for years. It's happening. End of day. The reply came seconds later. Perfect. Dinner tonight? I took a long breath and looked around the space that had for nearly 20 years been the only constant in a career defined by quiet resilience. Framed thank you notes from clients, hand-drawn cards from interns, an old photo of my team laughing during our holiday lunch. The very people who made all those long days and hard choices worthwhile. I wasn't leaving defeated, I was leaving prepared. And Monday was going to be a very different story. It started, like most betrayals do, with a careless mistake, small, almost unnoticeable if I hadn't trained myself over the years to catch things others missed. A misplaced CC on an internal thread late one Thursday night when I was already in bed, sipping peppermint tea and trying to coax my aching joints to settle after another long day of pretending everything was fine. My phone buzzed beside me, and though I usually ignored emails after 9 p.m., something in the subject line, Phase 2 personnel strategy, internal only, pulled at my instincts like a thread unraveling a sleeve I hadn't realized was fraying. I opened it and read, then reread. And as each line unspooled across the screen, my breath slowed. It was a memo, confidential, of course, circulated between Amanda, Darren, and a handful of the younger department heads. The language was dry, professional, coldly efficient in the way only corporate cruelty could be. My name appeared halfway through a bullet-pointed list, categorized under legacy optimization, non-scalable talent. Non-scalable. That was their label for someone like male woman in her late 50s, cancer survivor, once the cornerstone of client trust, now a liability in their eyes. They weren't just planning to phase me out, They were building a campaign around choosing the language of innovation to sweep out the very people who had laid the groundwork for the success they now stood on. I was listed right between someone who had just returned from bereavement leave and another whose only flaw was being 2 years shy of retirement. For a long moment, I didn't move. The glow of the screen cast a pale wash over my bedroom, highlighting the framed photo on my nightstand me with the original Langford team, all smiles, arms linked, back when we worked in borrowed conference rooms and took pay cuts just to keep the lights on during the recession. I remember those days clearly not because they were easy, but because we mattered to one another. Now, I was being cataloged like office furniture no longer in fashion, but shock quickly gave way to something sharper, not rage. Not yet. What I felt was the crisp, silent clarity of understanding. They hadn't stumbled into this. They had planned it. Amanda's whole refresh was never about building forward, it was about rewriting history to exclude the ones who made it. I spent that night wide awake. Not in despair, but in motion. I pulled out the leather-bound notebook I always kept in my bottom drawer, the one where I'd quietly documented every major improvement I'd made to the firm's client systems over the last year. Enhancements they praised in meetings, but never truly acknowledged. And I had more than notes. I had files, prototypes, and version histories, all built on my personal laptop, long after office hours, when insomnia and chemo had made sleep feel optional. Those lonely nights, when the pain in my body wouldn't let me rest, I had coded, tested, refined, driven not by obligation but by purpose, by the stubborn refusal to let my mind atrophy just because my body was under siege. What I built during that time wasn't just a system, it was a lifeline, and it belonged to me. By morning, I had transferred everything to an encrypted drive. Every update I had written, every efficiency I had created, every workflow I had reimagined, they were mine, and I had timestamps to prove it. It wasn't just preparation anymore. It was protection. I knew I couldn't stay silent, not completely, but I also knew that fighting from inside the system was pointless. Amanda had allies now, people invested in the myth she was building about visionary disruption, and I was nothing more than a blemish on her record she intended to scrub clean. But outside those walls, I still had relationships. I had built bridges across this industry, many of which Amanda didn't even know existed. One in particular had remained quietly intact over the years. Jonathan Webb, CEO of Bellwind Capital, one of Langford Cole's fiercest competitors, and a man who had once tried to recruit me during a conference in Chicago nearly a decade ago. I had declined back then out of loyalty, but now loyalty had become a one-sided contract. That Friday, just hours after the severance envelope slid across the table toward me, I sat across from Jonathan in the quiet corner of a restaurant far from downtown, where no one knew us and the servers didn't rush. "They finally did it," he said, his tone somewhere between sympathy and satisfaction. "I've been waiting for this call." "So had I replied, sliding the drive across the table. "Everything you need is on here." He raised an eyebrow. "All the improvements to the portfolio platform? And more. Versioned, documented, legally mine." They let me go under the impression I was walking out with nothing but a cardboard box, but I left with the foundation they never understood or valued. Jonathan didn't rush. He scanned a few files, nodding slowly, then looked up with a quiet grin. "You realize what this means, don't you?" I did. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming control of my story, of refusing to be erased from a legacy I had helped create. "And what about your team?" he asked. "They trust you. Some of them will follow." "Most already said they would," I answered. "They've seen too much. They're tired of being treated like tools instead of people. We didn't shake hands. We didn't toast. It wasn't that kind of moment. Instead, we sat in silence for a while, letting the weight of the unspoken settle between us. Then Jonathan leaned back, eyes sharp with resolve. "Caroline Harper," he said, "welcome to Bellwind Capital." And just like that, the betrayal was no longer a wound, it was fuel. I returned to my office not with bitterness, but with clarity, the kind that only comes when the final piece of the puzzle clicks into place. The box they'd given me, half-packed with the remnants of 2 decades family photos, awards no one mentioned anymore, and a coffee mug from the old building before the rebrand, sat silently on my desk, waiting for closure. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. Outside, the office carried on as if nothing had happened. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and hollow laughter drifted from cubicles where people whispered what they didn't have the courage to say aloud. Word had already begun to spread, whispers that I'd been let go, murmurs about Amanda's new direction and Ethan's quiet promotion. No one dared meet my eye directly, but I felt their glances follow me like shadows too polite to speak. I spent the next few hours doing what I had always done best, cleaning up after everyone else. But this time, it wasn't for them. It was for me. Every project I had touched, every client file, every procedural document I'd created over the years, I organized it all meticulously. Not because they deserved the favor, but because I knew they wouldn't be able to understand it without me. And when they tried to pretend I had been expendable, the silence left in my absence would tell the truth louder than I ever could. Just before noon, my team began trickling in one by one, each of them carrying some excuse to stop by, pretending to bring files or ask process questions, but their eyes said everything their lips couldn't. Miguel, my most trusted lead developer, closed the door behind him and sat without speaking at first. Finally, he asked, "Is it true? After everything, you're just gone?" I smiled gently, folding a sticky note in half without looking at him. "Not exactly." He studied me a moment, his brow furrowed in thought, then quietly nodded. I slid a card across the desk with nothing more than my personal email scribbled neatly on it. "Check that tonight," I said softly, "and don't talk to anyone about it." Not yet. By the time HR arrived for the formalities, I was already 10 steps ahead. Darren, the same man who wouldn't look me in the eye during the morning ambush, read through his checklist like a man trying to escape a burning building without anyone noticing. He slid an NDA across the desk with trembling fingers, his voice flat as he recited the usual lines about proprietary materials and employer rights. "You acknowledge that all work produced during your employment belongs to Langford Cole," he said, almost like a prayer. I met his gaze and replied evenly, "Of course. Anything I created with company resources, on company time, belongs to Langford by Cole." He didn't notice the phrasing, but I saw the flicker of relief in his expression as I signed. Once the legal dance ended, I sealed the final box and stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting my eyes drift across the office one last time. I had spent more hours in that room than I had in my own home, poured more of myself into those walls than I had into anything else since my children moved away. And yet, in the end, not a single executive had come by to say goodbye, not even Ethan. I was about to step out when, as if on cue, his voice came from behind me. Too casual to be sincere. "Heading out already?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe with the loose tie of someone who thought charm could mask betrayal. I turned slowly. "All set," I said, resting both hands on the box. "Well," he shrugged, "no hard feelings, right? You had a good run, Caroline, but this place needs fresh energy." I smiled politely, keeping my tone even. "You'll probably enjoy the peace and quiet once I'm gone." He chuckled, clearly thinking he'd disarm me. "Maybe it's time to slow down, enjoy life, take up gardening." I didn't blink. "Oh, I'm not retiring," I replied, brushing past him with the box in hand. "I already have something lined up. Starts Monday." He blinked. "Oh?" I stopped just long enough to let the pause settle. "A leadership role, strategic development, somewhere that still values experience." I didn't wait for a response. As I walked out of the building past reception, through the lobby, out into the crisp Minnesota air, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not revenge, not relief, something quieter, stronger, like the hum of power just before a storm breaks. That night, while Amanda and her executive team toasted to cleaning house and Ethan rehearsed new titles in front of the mirror, I sat across from Jonathan Webb in a private booth at Bellwin Capital's favorite restaurant, the kind of place where no one asks questions and everything is finished in soft mahogany. "They walked right into it," he said, swirling his wine. "They never even asked what I'd been working on," I replied, and that was true. In their rush to discard me, they had never paused to consider what they were throwing away. For the past year, I had been building on weekends, late nights, lunch breaks. No one noticed I skipped. Not just a software platform, but a system owned designed to outperform anything Langford Cole had ever deployed. "I've already filed the provisional patent," I continued, sliding him the documentation. "Every line of code, every interface spec, built entirely on my own time, logged, time-stamped, clean. Jonathan smiled. With this, we won't just catch up. We'll surpass them before Q2. I nodded. But it wasn't the numbers that satisfied me, it was the certainty. The calm, deliberate turning of the page. They underestimated me, I said. They always have. They're about to learn just how wrong they were, he said, raising his glass. I clinked mine to his, not with a toast of vengeance, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had been cast aside. Not because they weren't valuable, but because their value had become inconvenient. And that's the thing about storms. You don't always hear them coming until the thunder arrives. I woke up before the alarm that Monday, not from anxiety, but from something quieter, more profound. For the first time in years, there was no rush. No inbox filled with crisis emails waiting for resolution before sunrise. No silent dread building in my chest as I buttoned up a blazer that had grown too familiar. Instead, I stood by the window of my apartment, coffee in hand, watching the early light spill across the Minneapolis skyline with a stillness I hadn't allowed myself to feel in decades. I had always believed in loyalty, not the hollow kind written into corporate mission statements, but the kind that shows up quietly each day, stays late when needed, sacrifices credit when it helps the team. That kind of loyalty had once defined me, but as I stood there watching the sun climb higher, I realized I had finally given it to someone new myself. At precisely 8:03 a.m., Bellwin Capital updated their homepage, and I watched it unfold in real time. Caroline Harper, appointed Director of Strategic Innovation. Bellwin secures exclusive rights to breakthrough portfolio system. The press release was crisp, direct, and most importantly public. It outlined not only my new role, but the proprietary system I had developed entirely on my own time, using my own tools, through long nights when chemotherapy left me too nauseous to sleep. It didn't just confirm my authorship, it declared it, proudly. While I took another sip of coffee, my phone lit up. First Jamie, the analyst who'd whispered her apologies the day I was let go, then Miguel, my most loyal team lead. Jamie, Caroline, what is going on? Everyone's freaking out. Miguel, emergency meeting. Amanda looks like she's seen a ghost. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted them to sit in it for a while. The confusion, the disbelief, the realization that I had not walked away defeated, but rather stepped into something greater, something they could never have seen coming. By 9:30, industry blogs had picked up the story. LinkedIn buzzed with speculation. Former clients of Langford, Cole, were already reaching out to Bellwin, nervous about the future of the system I had built and that they now realized no one at their current firm fully understood. Even a few employees still clinging to Langford's sinking ship began posting cryptic updates phrases like new beginnings and excited for what's next peppered my feed like digital breadcrumbs. At 10:17, my phone rang again. Amanda's number. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice calm. Hello, Amanda. Her tone was tight but practiced. Caroline, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We'd like to talk about the platform you took with you. I didn't take anything, I replied evenly, watching a pigeon land on the balcony rail. What I built on my own time, with my own equipment. It's all outlined in Section 14 of the employment contract. You remember that one, don't you? There was a pause, just long enough for the panic to settle in. Let's be reasonable, she said. We're open to negotiating maybe a licensing arrangement. I'm fully booked this week, I replied, sipping my coffee. But I'm sure our legal teams will have plenty to discuss. I ended the call before she could reply. Within the hour, more messages poured in. Miguel again, with a brief update. They're tearing through every server. Amanda's locked in her office. Everyone's panicking. Then Jamie. Clients are calling non-stop. No one knows how to use the system. I replied simply, they won't have to look far. That weekend, I had sent personal offers to every single member of my former team, each one custom tailored, with better pay, improved benefits, and above all, respect. Most responded within hours. Some even cried on the phone. Even Jamie, who had seemed hesitant, wrote, "If you'll have me, I'm in." By noon, Bellwin's HR was fielding onboarding for a dozen former Langford staffers, while their legal team began sorting through incoming licensing inquiries from Langford's biggest accounts I had kept stable for years, often with nothing more than late-night calls and quiet reassurance. At 12:47 p.m., another name popped up on my screen. Ethan. I hesitated for a moment before answering. His voice was forced into a tone of concern, the kind that only shows up when desperation starts to stain the edges. Caroline, listen, maybe we were hasty. We'd like to talk. There might be a role. Ethan, I interrupted gently. I'm flattered, truly. But I think you're about to be very busy. You can't do this, he hissed, dropping the pretense. You're burning bridges. No, I said, my voice low and calm. I'm just crossing one you never noticed I was building. I hung up. By Tuesday morning, the cracks in Langford coal were no longer whispers, they were gaping fissures. Financial news outlets were dissecting the situation. Clients were publicly questioning leadership stability, and investors were calling emergency board meetings. A friend, still inside the company, texted me, Amanda's blaming Ethan. Ethan's blaming Darren. No one knows who actually read the employment clauses. The board's livid. Meanwhile, I walked into Bellwin's headquarters surrounded by familiar faces, Miguel, Jamie, and the others, all energized in a way I hadn't seen in years. Jonathan met us at the elevators with a stack of new contracts and an expression of restrained glee. 3 of Langford's biggest clients just reached out, he said. They want out of their contracts. They want in with us. I nodded. It won't stop there. That afternoon, as we finalized the rollout strategy, Denisione of Langford's longest-standing clients asked to meet. Over coffee in a quiet midtown cafe, she didn't waste time. We've worked with you for a long time, Caroline. Amanda's team doesn't understand the system, and frankly, we don't trust them to learn it. You won't have to, I said. We're ready. The infrastructure is already live. Seamless transition. She leaned back, visibly relieved. Then, we're coming with you. By Wednesday, Langford stock had dropped 15%. By Thursday, analysts were questioning Amanda's future. And by Friday, Bellwin was being praised for its bold acquisition, not just of software, but of people, culture, and vision. And I, the woman they called non-essential, was the one they had to credit for all of it. 2 weeks after Bellwin Capital officially secured the licensing agreement, I found myself standing at the edge of the new innovation floor, sunlight pouring through tall windows that overlooked the river. The air smelled like fresh paint and purpose clean, ambitious, ready. Around me, my team moved with the kind of energy I hadn't seen in years. They smiled easily, collaborated without fear, and for the first time in a long while, no one was watching their back. Our system was already outperforming projections, and clients who had once feared change were now eager participants in something they could trust. What we'd created wasn't just functional, it was elegant, intuitive, stable, and most importantly, free of the ego that had weighed down every decision at Langford Coal. The licensing deal had not come quietly. Langford's board, after a brutal 2-week spiral of falling stock prices, investor revolts, and hemorrhaging clients, finally agreed to every term. Full backdated payment, formal public acknowledgement of my authorship, and strict limitations on further use. Their press statement, brief and bureaucratic, read like an obituary for a version of leadership that had failed to understand the very foundation it had been built upon. Langford Coal formally recognizes Caroline Harper as the sole creator of the client portfolio management system implemented between 2018 and 2023, and acknowledges her continued contribution to innovation in the financial sector. It was neat, polished, sanitized, and far too late. I should have felt vindicated. In some ways, I did. But what settled over me wasn't triumphant, it was a quiet, complicated calm. You don't rebuild a life just to throw a victory party. You rebuild it so no one ever gets to bulldoze it again. Later that day, Miguel stopped by my office, a mischievous glint in his eye as he handed me his tablet. You've got to see this, he said, almost whispering. I took it and read the headline. Langford, Coal Leadership Shakeup. CEO Amanda Graves and Product Director Ethan Morris step down amid client exodus. Licensing debacle. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was simply release. They had pushed me out to make room for themselves, and in doing so, they had carved a hollow space where integrity used to live. That emptiness had collapsed beneath them. But the final note came not from the press, nor the markets, but in the form of a call. I was wrapping up some documents late in the evening when my office phone rang a number I didn't recognize, though something about it felt familiar. I answered, and a voice I hadn't expected filled the line. "Caroline," said Denise Stanton, Langford's interim legal counsel. Her tone was softer than I remembered, almost uncertain. "I wanted to reach out personally. On behalf of what's left of our leadership team, I want to apologize for how things unfolded, for how you were treated. Many of us didn't agree with the decision, but no one spoke up," I said quietly, finishing her sentence for her. She didn't argue. There was only silence on the line for a long moment. "We would be open," she began again, carefully this time, "to future collaboration. If there were ever a time when—" I stopped her with the gentlest voice I could muster. "Denise, I've moved on, and so has my team. There's nothing left for us back there." She thanked me for my time, her words formal but laced with something that sounded a lot like regret. I ended the call with no bitterness, just the soft certainty that some bridges once burned don't need rebuilding. That night, as I walked through Bellwin's quiet offices, I paused by the development wing and saw Jamie leading a whiteboard session while Miguel nodded beside her. They were animated, confident, no longer second-guessing themselves or shrinking into corners when executives passed by. Seeing them that way, respected, engaged, alive with possibility, meant more to me than any title ever could. Jonathan found me later by the windows, hands in his pockets, his expression reflective. "You know," he said, "this isn't just a company win. People are talking. The whole industry's rethinking how it treats the people who actually build things." I nodded. "Maybe next time, someone will hesitate before calling experience dead weight." He smiled. "You didn't just prove them wrong, Caroline. You reminded them what right looks like." As the sun dipped below the skyline and the city lights began to flicker on like scattered stars, I allowed myself for the first time in a long time to feel not just relief, but pride. Not for the takedown, not for the headlines, not even for the apology that came too late to matter, but for having walked through fire, illness, betrayal, and silence only to come out stronger, clearer, and more myself than I had ever been. This wasn't revenge. This was restoration. And it was mine. Not long after the dust settled, I found myself back in a place that had once represented loss and uncertainty. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and I was visiting the oncology wing of the same hospital where I'd spent countless nights not that long ago, curled beneath thin blankets, watching the ceiling tiles in silence as machines hummed beside me and the future felt like a coin flip no one dared call. I passed a nurse, I remembered Claire, with the kind eyes and gentle voice, and we exchanged a nod, both of us carrying the weight of unspoken memory. It was here, in this sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor, that I first began to imagine a future. I couldn't yet see one not defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I was still capable of building. As I stood outside room 213, the same one where I had once clutched a paper cup of ice chips and tried not to cry during conference calls, I realized just how far I'd come, not in miles, but in meaning. The people who tried to erase me never understood that you cannot measure a person's worth by what you see in a boardroom. They didn't see the nights I couldn't lift my arms but still logged into the system to debug a client dashboard. They didn't see the mornings I smiled for the team, even as my body rebelled against the chemicals fighting to keep me alive. And they certainly never saw that resilience, once awakened, does not retreat. It deepens, it sharpens, it learns. I didn't just survive the disease, I survived what came after. The quiet discard, the casual dismissal, the cruel assumption that age and illness made me less useful. But they were wrong. And not just about me. They were wrong about all of us. Because for every seasoned worker quietly holding a company together behind the scenes, for every woman who's told her best years are behind her, for every survivor who's been overlooked, the moment the scars fade there is a moment like mine, waiting to unfold. A moment when the tables turn not through rage, but through readiness. Not through vengeance, but through vision. When your experience becomes not an afterthought, but an asset. When your voice, long ignored, returns not louder, but clearer than ever. They thought I was done. They thought I was tired, obsolete, expendable. But what they didn't understand is that people who face their own mortality don't play small anymore. We don't settle. We don't wait to be chosen. And we certainly don't ask permission to lead. So if there's one thing I hope stays behind long after my name fades from headlines or executive directories, it's this. Never underestimate someone who's walked out of a hospital and chosen to stand again. Because once you've learned to rebuild yourself from the inside out, there is no corporate strategy, no restructuring plan, no smug executive title that can ever take your worth from you again. This wasn't just my story, it belongs to every quiet fighter who's ever been told to step aside and chose instead to rise. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs reminding that their value doesn't expire with age, illness, or title. Subscribe to the Underdog's Revenge for more stories of resilience, justice, and comeback. COD, your story's not over. Let's make sure the world hears it.